We good to go? Do I have your thumbs up, Jordan? Hi, everyone. Hi to those of you whom I know and also to those whom I don't. Welcome to this PAR Center Presents presentation. It's really nice to have you with us on this lovely day. Oh, hang on, I'm just going to wait a second for Walter because he is connecting to audio. Hi, Walter.
Hey.
So welcome everyone. I'm Sarah Stroud. I am the director of the PAR Center for Ethics, of which a highlight for me is being able to bring interesting, thought-provoking speakers to our community to speak to us, students, and the general public. So thanks a lot for joining us for this one. Normally, I would delay getting this session underway by forcing you to listen to an ad for our upcoming talks, but I don't have any. This is our last talk of this year. We will come out with a full slate of speakers next year, which we all hope can be in person, as indeed Grant was originally to be 1 year ago, but he has graciously both waited a year and consented to do this on Zoom. So a rather poor second, but we're very happy to have you with us, Grant. Grant Rozeboom holds a PhD from Stanford University in philosophy, and he is currently an assistant professor of business ethics and corporate responsibility at St. Mary's College of California. His research and teaching concern a range of issues in normative and applied ethics, including the nature and implications of moral equality, which I think this talk falls under, respect for persons, and moral responsibility. He's currently engaged in a number of really interesting sounding projects, exploring how workplaces can better respect the moral equality of persons, how companies should or shouldn't influence their employees to be more ethical, and when companies deserve credit for doing what's right. So it's wonderful to have someone with the kind of training in subtle and precise thinking that we try to instill in philosophy programs tackling these important issues about businesses and corporations. Although that's not so much what we're going to hear about today, Grant. Today we're going to hear about a class of persons that I think are taking a larger and larger role in our society. And Grant will tell us about when the vain couldn't care less. So let's please welcome Grant Rozeboom. He'll give his talk and then we'll go right to Q&A in our usual informal fashion. Welcome, Grant. Thanks so much for coming back to speak to us a year later.
Thanks so much. Thanks to you all for joining this session, and thanks especially to Sarah and Jordan and the folks at the PAR Center for hosting this. So what I want us to think about together today is a basic moral question about a kind of vice. I'm going to call the vice vanity, and what I mean by vanity is unjustifiably expecting higher regard from others than you deserve. And I'm interested in asking this basic moral question about vanity, first because I think vanity raises some puzzles. And these puzzles have to do with kind of our varying intuitive responses to encountering vain people. But more than that, I think once we ask this question, we realize that once we start thinking harder about vanity and the moral problems it poses, we come across broader pressing issues about how to respond to those who have certain vices and how to hold them responsible or not, and also how to think about the ways in which organizations can either cultivate or help tamp down vices such as vanity. So that's where I want us to go eventually today. The way in which I'm going to engage these issues is going to be somewhat programmatic. I kind of want to lay out a number of the important issues that I think arise and draw some distinctions that I think we need to keep in mind in addressing them. But the work's going to be far from done by the time I'm done talking 30 minutes from now. So here's the basic question I want to ask about vanity. Is it ever a serious moral problem? And then the contrast implicit in that question is, or is this just kind of an annoying trait that maybe at worst just leads you to want to avoid certain kinds of vain people? And I think our everyday experiences of encountering vain people point us in both directions. Sometimes when we think about vanity in others, or if we're being honest, vanity in ourselves, we think, yeah, that's not great. It's kind of annoying. Maybe sometimes it's kind of a charming quirk, but not really a big deal. On the other hand, sometimes when we encounter vain people, we feel seriously offended. We feel demeaned. We use words like toxic to describe the person and their impact on those around them. These are two really different kinds of reactions to have what appears to be basically the same vice. And so an initial puzzle that comes up is this: are we making a mistake when we have one or the other kind of reaction? Should we be taking vanity more seriously all the time? Or on the flip side, when we feel outraged by vanity, should we back off a bit and treat it as merely annoying? Now, to motivate what I really want us to focus on today, I want to sketch a kind of person that started to receive some scholarly attention that I think vividly illustrates when we're apt to see vanity as most morally serious. And this kind of person is what management scholars are calling a narcissistic corporate leader or corporate executive. Now, I put narcissistic in scare quotes because when you hear the label narcissistic or narcissism, you're apt to think about the diagnosable personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. But that has a specific diagnostic typology, which is not exactly what scholars have had in mind when they're studying what they call narcissistic corporate leaders. And so I don't want us to get confused into thinking that these are all diagnosable narcissistic individuals who are being studied, though perhaps some of them are. So we just have kind of a looser folk type in mind when we're talking about narcissistic corporate leaders. So here's the kind of person that scholars are starting to pay more attention to and how they impact organizations. I hope not, but unfortunately suspect that some of you may have encountered such a person in your previous experiences, and I apologize for dredging up bad memories by sketching this type for you. So here's what a narcissistic corporate leader is liable to be like. Initially, when they show up, imagine that they're hired as your new boss. They might actually be charming and quite friendly. They host a generous lunch to get to know new employees. They implement various kinds of regime change, making it creating a more flexible work environment, perhaps making it easier for employees to take personal time off, things like this. But then red flags start popping up. One day, perhaps one of your coworkers comes up to you and lets you know that they were just berated by the boss for being ungrateful. The previous week, the coworker had requested personal time off per the new policy that's been implemented. They received it as expected. All seemed well, but then all of a sudden, a few days later, the boss took them aside and berated them for being ungrateful, accused them of not being a team player and not being sufficiently loyal. And then all of a sudden, you notice meetings start to go differently. It seems as though things are going fine so long as the manager is able to sort of control the flow and people seem to respect the decisions they want to make. But as soon as someone challenges the direction that the boss wants to go, they're publicly belittled and berated. And it just seems clear in general that the boss wants to use meetings as a way of dominating decision-making and exercising control. And then this just uncovers what seems to be a serious underlying trait in this boss. Going forward, they start to pilfer good ideas that are suggested by you or your coworkers, and they're presented as their own. They expect to take full credit for them. They continually complain that no one really appreciates them and their unique talents and abilities and what they're contributing to the organization. They constantly threaten to quit and go someplace where they will be better appreciated. And they also tend to write off any and all criticism that they receive. People just don't understand their style, and the kind of experience and managerial techniques that they know are so effective. Okay, so you're starting to get a feel for the type. And again, apologies if this is just all bringing up bad memories for you. So this is the kind of vain person that I think helps us appreciate when and why we're liable to see vanity as not just annoying, but as a real serious moral kind of problem. And I think of the so-called narcissistic boss as vain because it seems like what's at the heart of the kind of vice that they present is that they expect to be regarded by others in an exaggerated, inflated sort of way. They expect others to esteem them, respect them, defer to them, be grateful to them in ways that seem to go far beyond what's reasonable or appropriate. So if we take seriously our reaction to someone like the narcissistic corporate leader, this tells us that at least sometimes we seem to think that vanity is morally serious. But again, this is not always our reaction to encountering vain people. So in raising this question, is vanity ever a serious moral problem? There are two things I want to do today. The first is try to draw some distinctions between different forms of vanity. And maybe that's going to help us see that there are only certain forms and not others that are morally serious. But to do that, we have to get beyond the broad understanding of vanity as just unjustifiably expecting unduly high regard. So we have to get more specific about the different forms that vanity can take. And then once we see the different forms that vanity can take, then we need to understand why, when and why the more serious forms really are morally bad. And here I want to raise two sub-questions. First, when we kind of key in onto the more specific bad forms of vanity, we want to know what kind of moral mistake is being made. When someone exhibits that kind of vice, what are they getting wrong, morally speaking? And then secondly, when we think about dealing with someone who has that kind of vanity, we want to know why they're hard to deal with. Why is it so frustrating and infuriating to encounter someone like the narcissistic corporate leader? And why I think it's hard, and the question I'm going to want us to focus on is, why is it hard to respond to them in a morally acceptable way? Why does it seem like we don't have good options for how to deal with them? So that's going to be our agenda. Let's jump in, starting with that first question, trying to better pin down the different forms of vanity. Now, one preliminary here. So I'm describing vanity as unjustifiably expecting higher regard than one deserves. I want to clarify what I mean by expecting. I don't mean predicting, like we might predict the weather. The vain person isn't predicting that they'll receive higher regard than they deserve. They have what you might call a normative expectation. They think that they should or ought to receive unduly high regard from others. And they're disposed to reliably act on and enforce that expectation. Sometimes this is modeled in terms of what philosophers and social psychologists call norm acceptance. So when I talk about vain people expecting higher regard from others, I have in mind this normative idea of expectation that derives from accepting norms that say, I deserve your esteem, or I deserve your admiration or gratitude. Now, again, even with that clarification in mind, we still kind of have this broad, uniform description of vanity that doesn't really help us understand the different forms it might take that might help us understand when specifically it's a serious moral problem. So one place where we can start to try to draw some important distinctions is in the kind of regard from others that vain people expect. So we're trying to understand different kinds of vanity, undue expectations of high regard. And so one thing you might wonder is, well, what exactly are they expecting in expecting high regard? And starting with some influential work done by Steve Darwall in moral philosophy, I think we can draw a distinction between two basic different kinds of regard that vain people might expect. One way of being highly regarded by others is to receive praise or esteem as achieving some kind of excellence along some measure. So I might want to be esteemed as a great scholar, or someone might want to be admired as a great athlete, or a boss might want to be respected as a great influential leader. So those are all forms of what we might call praise or esteem. And I'm going to say that when a vain person expects that kind of regard, that's arrogance. Now, a very different kind of high regard that a vain person might expect has to do with being recognized as having authority that others have to defer to. So the kind of regard that they're expecting isn't necessarily to be admired for being great at something or in some way. Instead, I just want you to listen to me, or I want you to obey me, or I want you to defer to my judgment and just accept it because I said so. So that's a kind of authority recognition. It's still a kind of regard. It's a form of regard with respect to which we can be vain, but it's importantly different from expecting praise or esteem. And so I'm going to call that second kind of regard, when vain people expect it, entitlement. Now, for the teachers in the room, there are two classic student stereotypes that we can use to illustrate this. There's the grade grubber, and then there's the discussion dominator. So there's the grade grubber, the student who, despite their aggressively mediocre work, comes to you expecting to be admired in the form of a higher grade than what they really deserve. That would be expecting a kind of praise or esteem, what I'm going to call arrogant. This is very different, though of course these traits can unfortunately coincide, but this is very different from the student who dominates discussion. They think that they deserve to set the agenda. They think that when they weigh in on an issue, that should be received as conclusive by their peers and perhaps by their professor. So they kind of dominate discussion in a way that conveys an expectation of deference and authority recognition from those around them. That's the discussion dominator, evincing something like entitlement. All right, so that's the first distinction in different kinds of vanity I want us to have in mind: arrogance versus entitlement. Not saying they're mutually exclusive, but they're importantly different forms that vanity can take. Now, another aspect of vanity where we can look for some important distinctions is the way in which a vain person carries their unjustifiable expectations. And in particular, an important question I think we should ask is, do they care about whether their regard expectations are correct? Or another way of putting it is, are they responsive to the considerations bearing on the correctness of their regard expectations? When a friend points out, hey, it seems like you're being a little unreasonable in the kind of admiration you're expecting, are they at all open to that kind of feedback or to those kinds of critical considerations? If the answer is yes, that's someone we might call a conscientious vain person. They still have unjustifiable expectations, but they're at least open to countervailing considerations that might call into question the sort of expectations they have. Or the answer might be no. They're sort of impervious to any and all feedback that they might receive about whether or not the expectations of high regard they have are reasonable or appropriate. We're going to call that kind of vain person smug, when they don't care at all about the correctness of their regard expectations. Now, right away, you might think there's something puzzling about the very possibility of a smugly vain person. Because already I've described vain people as being attached to norms and having normative expectations, demanding high regard from others. And so you might wonder, how could someone be attached to these normative expectations, expecting to receive high regard from others, and not care about them being correct, not care about or be open to the reasons bearing on those regard expectations? It's a good question. The first thing to say in response is just to point out that it's possible. Given what I think is our best characterization about the nature of norm acceptance, it just seems like accepting norms, including norms demanding high regard from others, is one thing, and caring about whether the expectations they generate are correct is another. That is, it's one thing to accept norms in the sense of having them guide your thought and action and being disposed to enforce them. And it's another to be responsive to reasons bearing on the correctness of those normative expectations. But you might think just showing the possibility doesn't tell us that much if that possibility isn't often or ever realized in real people that we encounter. So a second thing I want to say is that there is a mechanism of self-deception that seems like it might be prevalent in vain people that could actually help explain why it is smugness could be a common form that their vanity takes. So let's understand self-deception in the following way. This is my preferred view of self-deception. When people are self-deceived in some way, they want to believe something, they mistreat evidence bearing on that belief, and then they come to believe as they want to believe in the face of their contrary evidence, because their desire to believe that way led them to mistreat their evidence. So that's a broad understanding of self-deception. It's called a motivationist account of self-deception. And I think there's a version of this that's plausibly common among vain people. They want to believe that they deserve high regard from others. And because they so want to believe that they deserve admiration or respect or deference or whatever it might be, they mistreat the evidence and reasons available to them that would tell them what the correct level of expectation of regard is. And because they mistreat their evidence and reasons, they come to believe that they deserve high regard, kind of flying in the face of the evidence that is plainly available to them. So that's a kind of vain form of self-deception. And I think it could give us an explanation of how vain people could become smug in the following two ways. First, once you form the self-deceived belief that you deserve high regard, kind of flying in the face of your evidence that you don't deserve that level of high regard, then you're open to various forms of confirmation bias, where now that you've formed the belief, you're really only looking for evidence that supports your belief, and you're liable to dismiss and ignore any considerations that would call that belief into question. And the second thing that can happen is that now that you believe you're deserving of unduly high regard that others are not deserving of, you would tend to take what they think about you less seriously. Because after all, you deserve high regard of some form that they don't. So who cares what they think? And so I think once self-deception kicks in, this is a natural explanation of why smug vanity might be a common form that vanity can take. So we can combine these two distinctions. I think they're cross-cutting, and they give us 4 forms of vanity. So again, the distinctions are between the kind of high regard that's expected. Is it esteem or praise, or instead deference? And then we want to know, do we care about the correctness of our inflated regard expectations? If yes, conscientious; if no, smug. And then that yields the following 4 forms of vanity: conscientious arrogance and smug arrogance, conscientious entitlement and smug entitlement. Now, to our underlying question, when should we really worry about vanity? When is it morally serious? Well, if we return to our initial character of the narcissistic corporate leader, I think it's clear they fall into that bottom right quadrant. What's really going on that's bothersome there is a kind of entitlement, because it's clear in how the boss wants to dominate meetings, in how they berate people into submission, and how they just expect people to follow their orders, that what they're after is not just or even ultimately a kind of admiration or praise, but instead they just want people to recognize them as having authority and as having deserved legitimate authority. And it seems smug because this seems to be someone who's entirely impervious to any and all feedback or information that would call into question this understanding they have of themselves as deserving the deference of others, and the way that is expressed through expectations of high regard. So what I want to do is just move forward not assuming that this is the only morally serious form of vanity, but with something like the following claim in mind. If vanity is ever morally serious, surely smug entitlement is going to be a morally problematic form of vanity. So let's run with that thought and begin thinking about why smug entitlement might present a morally serious problem. And let's start with a question of what kind of moral mistake the smug entitled person is making. Notice that if you have entitlement in the sense that I'm talking about here, where you expect more deference from others, you expect them in a basic way to recognize you as having more authority than they do, you're denying that others have the same basic standing as you to be respected and obeyed. So entitlement is basically a denial that at some basic level, we have the same basic or mutual or reciprocal authority with respect to our relationship. And this amounts in a colloquial way to the claim that I matter more than you. That's what's conveyed by entitled forms of vanity. Now, why is that a serious moral mistake? Well, one way of understanding how it's a serious moral mistake is that it compromises and flat out rejects the ideal of relating as equals. So this is an ideal that's been extremely influential in post-Enlightenment moral thought. There are various ways of understanding why it's an important ideal. Maybe it's grounded in the equal dignity of all persons. Maybe in a more pragmatic sense, it's a rejection of aristocratic forms of society that prevailed in the Western world prior to the Enlightenment. However you understand why it's morally important, it's clear we cling to it as morally important. This idea that how we ought to relate at a fundamental level is as moral equals, as seeing each other as having the same basic personal authority, which means something like this. We each have the same basic standing to order our own affairs, to make decisions about our lives. And we each have the same basic standing to shape our interactions with one another. And more than that, in our relations with one another, we should outwardly express and convey that we each have the standing and recognize one another as having the same basic standing. That's the ideal of relating as equals, as I understand it. And it entails two basic patterns of behavior. One kind of pattern of behavior is mutual deference. When you make a decision about your own life, I'm disposed to defer to that, probably not in all circumstances, but to a large extent. And when you and I are interacting and we're trying to work out some joint issue or problem, I take you voicing your interests and concerns as just as important as me voicing my interests and concerns in shaping our interaction. So that's a kind of mutual deference. It also entails various forms of civility. I don't mean civility writ large, all the forms that civility can take, but an important aspect of civility concerns behaviors that conventionally express the message I was talking about on the previous slide, that I'm not more important than you are. I grew up in the Midwest, which is kind of a famously polite culture. And so it's kind of a case study in the maybe more extreme forms that civility can take, but especially in the wintry months. A very simple kind of civil behavior is if someone is, I don't know, probably within 6 yards of you as you enter a building, you hold open the door for them. And it's a way of kind of outwardly expressing, I'm not more important than you. It's a way of expressing that I accept that they have the same basic standing that I do. Now, entitlement, the entitled form of vanity, rejects both of these two central aspects of relating as equals. It's a rejection of mutual deference because I don't think it should be mutual. I think you should defer to me in ways that I don't need to defer to you. And I think it leads to a qualified rejection of civility. I say qualified because there's a way in which if I'm an entitled person, it might be strategic for me to be civil in some ways so as to try to secure your deference to me. But that's going to be the limit of my attachment to civility. It doesn't have any intrinsic importance in terms of expressing how I really respect you or the kind of standing that I really think you have. And so the attachment to civility is going to be fragile, and in that sense is still a rejection of the civility component of relating as equals. So this, I think, is a way of understanding at least one basic moral mistake that's made by the smug entitled person. In virtue of their entitlement, they're rejecting this idea of relating as equals, and in that way making themselves unfit to relate to others as equals. And something that's important when we think about hierarchical organizations, which most complex organizations, including businesses, but also universities and churches and all kinds of organizations, when they're organized hierarchically and individuals are given discretionary power over others, the problem posed by entitlement in terms of rejecting the ideal of relating as equals tends to be magnified. It's easily cultivated because when you give me discretionary power, it's natural for me to start to think, hey, I deserve that. Like, why else would I have all of this say over what other people do if I didn't deserve it? And in a wider social context in the US that preaches the idea of meritocracy, this idea can take hold, that when I have discretionary authority, that's something I deeply deserve. And that can cultivate a sense of entitlement. And then what can happen is as people start to exercise their sense of entitlement through their role authority in their organization by, say, micromanaging others or using meetings as an opportunity to display dominance, it can seem licensed because after all, they're just exercising authority that the organization has given them. So I think there's a way in which when we think about entitlement showing up in hierarchical organizations, this danger, this mistake of rejecting the ideal of relating as equals can be magnified. All right, the last thing I want to explore is why it's hard to respond to smug entitled persons. So the first aspect of thinking about smug entitlement as morally serious is thinking about the kind of moral mistake that smug entitled people make. That's the rejection of the ideal of relating as equals. But now we're thinking about people on the receiving end of smug entitlement. So think, for instance, about the employees of the narcissistic boss. Why is it hard for them to know how to respond to or deal with that kind of person? And I think it's helpful to think about a dilemma that the philosopher and psychologist Hannah Picard has posed in thinking about therapists dealing with patients who have personality disorders. So Picard had some experience with and also interviewed therapists who worked at a center that dealt specifically with what are called the cluster B personality disorders. This includes narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder. And for a lot of these kinds of personality disorders, the individuals are really mean. They're insulting, they're often manipulative, they're aggressive, they fly off the handle really easily. And so if you're a counselor or a therapist working with someone who has one of these personality disorders, Picard thought you face a kind of dilemma. On the one hand, you can blame individuals when they go overboard and are insulting or deceptive or manipulative because they're making decisions, and in making those decisions, treating you very wrongly. They're being mean, they're being abusive, and that seems to call for blame, and specifically angry blame. But if you engage in angry blame, it seems counterproductive, especially if you're thinking from the perspective of the therapist. It's likely to elicit even worse behavior from the individual that you're trying to work with. And they also seem totally unreceptive to the message that blame is trying to send to them, which is shape up, stop treating me that way. But then it seems like your only other option is to not blame them. And this also seems unacceptable. Because if you don't blame them, if you don't respond in a way that tries to say, hey, shape up, that's not okay, it seems like you're not respecting yourself as someone who deserves to be treated better. And you're not holding them accountable for behavior that it does seem like they should be and can be held accountable for. So Picard thought there was this kind of dilemma when we think about dealing with individuals that have these sorts of personality disorders. It seems like there's a similar kind of hard choice that individuals face when they're dealing with smug, entitled persons. On the one hand, you can angrily blame them, but that's going to seem counterproductive or pointless in much the way that Picard thought blaming individuals with the cluster B personality disorders was going to be counterproductive or pointless. They're totally impervious to the feedback. They're not receptive. It seems likely to elicit even worse behavior from them going forward. On the other hand, if you don't blame them, it seems like you're not sticking up for yourself. There's a kind of self-respect that goes into blaming others when they treat you as poorly as the smug, entitled person is going to treat you. So what do? Well, Picard's solution is what she calls responsibility without blame. You hold them responsible in the sense that you see them as making choices and being able to do better in the future and communicating that to them, but you hold back from angry blame and its expression. Now, there are more details to Picard's view, which I'm happy to talk about further. But one thing I want to note here is that it doesn't seem to do much for the problem we have in dealing with smug, entitled persons. For one, it seems like the angry reactions are a part of what we're trying to vindicate in making sense of how do we deal with smug, entitled people. If anyone deserves angry blame, it seems like these folks do. The other thing that's puzzling is that it lowers the bar for the kind of agency that we're measuring our accountability reactions to. Basically, it's saying, even though they're totally impervious to the reasons conveyed by blame, still blame them anyway, hold them responsible anyway. And that doesn't seem to address the way in which it seems counterproductive or frustrating to blame and try to hold this kind of person responsible. Now, an alternative kind of solution goes back to my suggestion that many kinds of vain people are also self-deceived, and to kind of have their self-deception in view as we're thinking about how to deal with them. After all, when someone's self-deceived, that means they have some control over what they come to think and then feel and do as a result. Self-deception is what philosophers of moral responsibility would call a reasons responsive process. And so when we think about addressing the entitled smug person, not just as smug and entitled, but also self-deceived, maybe that makes better sense of what we're trying to convey to them in holding them responsible and blaming them. It makes better sense of the ways in which they might still be open to the kind of feedback we're trying to give them. A limitation to this way of understanding how to deal with and hold smug, entitled persons responsible is that it's just not clear how prevalent self-deception is. That's in part an empirical question. How often does self-deception show up in the minds of smug, entitled persons? And I'm not sure the answer to that question. Finally, a last alternative is just to say we have to give up on something intuitive about how we deal with smug, entitled persons. And perhaps something we give up is just the thought that they really deserve angry blame. Even though that might be a part of our practice that we want to vindicate, maybe at the end of the day, the only way to make coherent sense of how to deal with these individuals in an acceptable way is to let go of that way of reacting to them. And one way of making sense of this kind of revisionary move is to think about what are the overarching purposes or justifications of our responsibility practices, our practices of holding others responsible and accountable. And that in turn raises big questions like, what is the point of holding people responsible? I can't offer my own tentative thoughts about the answer to that question here. I just hold this out as another alternative for making good sense of how we can deal with smug, entitled persons. All right, so just to wrap up, my main aim was to raise the question of when and how vanity poses a serious moral problem. I started by getting more detailed about the structure of vanity and drawing two distinctions that gave us 4 forms of vanity. We then focused on smug entitlement as the candidate for being morally serious. The kind of mistake made by that sort of person who has smug entitlement is rejecting the ideal of relating as equals. And the reason why that person is so hard to deal with in virtue of their smugness is that they're entirely impervious to feedback. And so we have to think about what is an acceptable way of holding them responsible and vindicating or not our intuitive angry reactions to them. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Grant. Such a thought-provoking taxonomy. I'm sure we're all slotting different people that we know into different groups as we speak. That was great. Thank you.
No names will be shared outside this.
That's right. And what happens at Parv Center Presents stays at Parv Center Presents. All right. So we do have time for discussion. Just put your electronic hand up, and I will see it and recognize you. Although actually, Grant, I have a Walter. Can I just ask my question first?
Of course, anybody can go before me, especially anybody from UNC for sure.
Oh no, we don't expect any extra deference. Grant, one question I had was about the sort of relative importance of the individual psychology of the toxic person versus the institutional context. Mm-hmm. I mean, it seemed like you wanted to get both in there because you said, what's really especially morally bad is, down in that entitled smugness quadrant. So that made it sound like most of the moral work was being done by the, specific nature of the person's psychology. But then you did say later that like the negative effects of that are magnified when they're in an organizational or institutional context where, they have discretionary power and they can exercise it as they see fit. So I guess I was curious about, what would you say to someone who, in answer to the question, when is it just annoying versus when is it really morally serious and toxic? What would you say to someone who actually wanted to prioritize the person's institutional role and say, basically what makes it serious and toxic is when the person is a boss. And then regardless of their like specific pathology, what makes them really dangerous is the way that they can poison, an entire workplace, the way that they can have effect on, relations among coworkers. So just interested to hear more about sort of the relative weight you assign to the individual psychology versus where they're situated within a social nexus.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there are 2 sides to how I would want to approach that issue. One side concerns the relationship between individual traits and social circumstance or social context. And this taps into long-standing debates in social psychology and moral psychology about in what sense does it make sense to attribute individuals with traits that are somewhat, but not entirely, independent of the circumstances that they're in. And so one thing to note is that even if you think a lot of moral work is being done just in the characterization of the kind of vanity that someone exhibits, that could still be kind of tacitly drawing on something about their situational circumstance, given that there might only be certain circumstances that sufficiently support or buttress that kind of trait in individuals. But the second aspect of it, and something else that you were bringing up, is isn't there a way in which it's only when someone has kind of some sort of formal authority over others that they can really let loose with their smug entitlement? And I think you're right that, if I'm just Joe Schmo on the street and I don't bear any sort of important organizational relationship to you or have any formal authority to you, that kind of limits, in practical terms, the ways in which I can exercise my entitlement over you. And so in terms of its impact on you and the opportunities that I have to demean you, or the opportunities I have to put pressure on you to bend to my whim, that's going to be much more limited. I don't think
Thank God.
Yes. I don't think it changes the nature of the mistake I'm making.
Right.
But you're right in terms of the number of opportunities someone has to express their vice and make it impact the experiences of others in a vivid way. It's certainly going to be more limited. That's right.
Thanks, Grant. Walter, Senator Armstrong.
So I wanted to ask about the external action versus the internal state, because it seemed like a lot of the problems that you cited were about berating and belittling and complaining. And those are all external actions that are admittedly caused by the internal state. But I wonder whether the internal state, when not associated with those external actions, is all that bad. Because one can imagine that a little bit of vanity might be required to motivate somebody to get recognition for their own work and to keep trying harder so people will recognize how smart they are. And it might actually have some positive effects when it is not expressed as belittling other people and so on.
So the thought is, it doesn't elicit the reaction from others as being morally serious until it's associated with the syndrome of behaviors that I listed. Is that the thought?
Yeah, the harm to others and the harm to the institution occurs when those behaviors occur. If the person uses it merely internally to motivate their own striving, then it doesn't have those harmful effects.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there are mild forms of vanity that, even in an intuitive way, we don't see as involving serious moral mistakes. And some of those might be associated with the kinds of traits that it might even be associated with a kind of grit, what goes under the heading of grit, for instance, which does seem to evolve a kind of resistance to certain kinds of negative indications about your own work, so you don't wither at the first out of 100 critical referee reports or something like that. So that seems right. I suspect first, though, that those helpful forms of vanity that we see as mild and maybe not even that vicious in the end, given the kinds of benefits that accrue to them, won't require an expectation of asymmetrical deference. So I suspect that those forms of vanity won't involve entitlement. And then the other thing to say about the disconnect between the trait itself and the different ways it can be expressed, I think it's true that the harm to others is not felt until it's expressed. But I think the way in which the behaviors are cognized as morally serious is in part by attributing to the source the rejection of the ideal of moral equality. That is a part of why I see your berating behavior or your meeting dominating behavior or your micromanaging behavior as so serious, is because I associate with it the view that you think you deserve to boss me around and you think that I deserve to be bossed around. If instead I tell myself the story, which at some point is going to become implausible, but if I tell myself the story, oh, I think that this is just kind of how they were taught to manage others. They just think this is what a good manager does, but they don't really expect as much deference as it seems like they're asking of us. How I experience and how I'm going to cognize the behaviors, I think, is going to be seen as much less morally serious. Still a problem, still annoying, but the edge will have been taken off, as it were.
Fabian Wendt.
Thank you. So I have a, maybe, I don't know, a nitpicky question on the scheme with the 4 types of vanity. So you make clear that you don't want, your target is not the narcissistic personality disorder, and then you presented this broader picture of what vanity is. And so I just wonder whether it might be too broad or too loose. So in particular, I thought, couldn't parents basically turn out to be classified as entitled smugs in the scheme? I mean, parents typically expect, deference to authority from their children, right? And they also, I mean, they might care in general on whether they really have that authority, but they don't expect the children to be in the position to challenge them or something. So what I was missing, I guess, was something like that the person actually doesn't have the authority, right? That they think they have. It's not just about making epistemic mistakes or something. They need to actually not have it. Parents, we assume, do have some authority and so on. And but then also I thought maybe that's a little bit related to what Walter just asked. Whether the real problem is in what you described later and earlier when you talked about the boss, like the belittling all these activities and so on. That's where where it comes to the fore, no? So anyway, I stop here.
Thanks. I really love this question in part because, as many folks are, I'm giving this talk from home with a first grader working on schoolwork in the other room, having previously given some stern instructions about how the schoolwork is to be completed. So this is striking a little too close to home. So I think on the one hand, I want to be open to discovering something surprising as a result of applying the typology. And it might turn out that, given how we should understand the moral standing of humans at different ages, that for many contemporary societies, parents are going to turn out as entitled smug, or at least entitled, because they're taking there to be an asymmetry or a severe asymmetry in authoritative standing where there is none. But you're right that that's going to turn out in part on the facts about what justifiable expectations of authority recognition we can have. The justifiable is in part a function of what reasons are available to persons for forming expectations about authority recognition from others. And it may turn out, I mean, here's another interesting possibility. It may turn out that parents have justifiable expectations of undeserved authority recognition. That is, as we learn more about child development, or as our social context comes to register more facts about the maturity of, say, adolescence, we learn that there's not much of an asymmetry in the moral standing between parents and adolescent kids, but it might still be justifiable for parents to have expectations otherwise, just because the evidence is still somewhat diffuse or isn't as available to them. So that's what I meant by unjustifiable expectations. It's only when someone is somehow rejecting reasons available to them for forming better or more correct expectations that it would fall into the category of vicious vanity.
We've got to quickly stomp out this idea that there might be no justified entitlement of parents over adolescents. I'm in a hurry to pass over that point and get home to my adolescent.
Yeah, I just have a first grader, so I'm not going to worry about that yet.
It's much easier for you. Yeah. Z, Quanbeck.
Thanks. I just had a question about the characterization of the distinction between conscientiousness and smugness. So you put it in terms of caring about the correctness of regard expectations, and that smugness typically involves involves caring about believing that you deserve high regard without caring about the correctness of the belief. I was wondering whether that's necessarily the case. I can imagine a person who is similarly smug, who actually cares about its being true that they deserve high regard. And they still engage in the motivated reasoning. They still engage in the same sorts of epistemic vices as the person who doesn't actually care at all about the truth, but just cares about having the belief that they deserve high regard because it'll make them feel good or something. Yeah, I was just wondering if maybe a different way to characterize it could be, in terms of the smug person is more epistemically vicious. They engage in this motivated reasoning, and perhaps the conscientious person is epistemically virtuous. They just maybe have misleading evidence. Maybe their parents told them that they were wonderful, and they justifiably believed on the basis of their parents' testimony that they do deserve this high regard, that sort of thing.
Yeah, thanks for that suggestion, Z. So I just want to make sure I understand the alternative proposal you're making. So your thought is not that, for the individuals I'm trying to characterize as smug, what might be true of them instead of them being kind of unresponsive to reasons in the way that I was describing is instead that basically they're epistemically vicious, but still caring about the correctness of their regard expectations. Is that right?
Yeah, so this would still, I think, be consistent with saying that they aren't responding to the reasons in the right way. But the explanation of why they're not responding to the reasons in the right way needn't at least necessarily be because they don't care about the correctness, but just because they manifest some other sort of epistemic vice, like engaging in motivated reasoning or what all the other things you described.
I see. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the first thing I want to say is friendly, which is just, I think that's probably right and does characterize a large class of vain individuals. And I think the remaining live question is what I characterize as smugness still capturing something important about the kinds of vain people that we encounter? Are there still going to be persons that, beyond just making entrenched epistemic errors, are also impervious to reasons or unresponsive to reasons in the way I describe? I think I'm gonna have to leave it as the open question there. My thought is yes, but I want to leave room for, it looks like maybe there might be one hand, and I'd be happy to follow up more, but thanks.
We will let you officially go after this last question, Grant, but I do think Grant's willing to hang around on the call for a little bit if people want to gather for any more informal discussion.
Sure.
But just so that we can answer all the hands, Ray?
Hi, thank you. I had two questions that relate to risk and projection. I was interested in particularly how the smug entitled vanity will, like for instance, will relate to, say, risk takers like jet fighter pilots or stockbrokers who are accustomed to making snap decisions without recourse or so. And the other is, what about a smug, entitled person projecting that disposition onto other people?
Like, will they be more disposed to see other people as having that disposition?
Right, yeah, or deny that they are denying some facts and they project that onto, say, an adversary, obviously dispensing those facts. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, so to the point about risk taking and not second guessing judgments. I mean, I think it would be the second piece of it that would be more closely associated with what I was describing as smug entitlement. I mean, you could imagine a very risk averse smug entitled person, but what would still be true of them is that they're not disposed to second guess their judgments when others try to raise any sorts of doubts or worries or objections or whatever it might be. They decided, they deserve to be the one that decided, and who cares what you think. Now, if they also are risk loving as opposed to risk averse, then yeah, that's also going to then underwrite a certain kind of, some people would call it bold, some people would call it reckless, depending on the context and the consequences. And you sometimes hear descriptions of surgeons, or you also describe fighter pilots as sometimes having this kind of very assertive, dominating, decisive way of proceeding that does sometimes seem to edge into the kind of smug entitlement I was describing. In terms of how they write off adversaries or other people who might get in their way, I mean, I think one thing that's built into entitlement is that you see other people as less deserving of deference. And so if someone is trying to approach you as your equal, which they are, you are going to see them as in their own way vain, because you think they're lesser than you. And so their attempt to approach you as an equal is going to be experienced as an affront. That seems right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Good to see you.
To see
Thank you. Thank you so
up to its usual high standards. Thank you.
Thank you. Even over Zoom, we're trying. Grant, thank you so much. This has been so interesting to think over. Let's officially thank and send off our speaker, but feel free to hang around. Thank you, Grant.
Oh, thanks so much. I enjoyed this so much and appreciate the helpful feedback. I'm open to the feedback.
So you say.
So I say.